So in this series of us discussing yoga, the what and why of yoga, well, not the series because it's still moving different. In this series of sessions where we're going to discuss yoga and the different ways that the different paths of yoga, we're going to learn about all of it. And in that description of these different paths of yoga, we'll get also much, much deeper into the philosophy of yoga and what those modifications of the mind are and how we ourselves are in charge of this whole operation towards liberation, freedom, wisdom, all of that. All right, and we're back for another episode session of Moving Different. I'm Tia Forkes Yogi, and this week we are going to discuss yoga, as always, right? But more specifically, all these different paths of yoga. We've been talking about very specifically the how of yoga. We've not really discussed why or what even is yoga. You can ask 1,000 different yogis, teachers, practitioners, however they identify themselves, anybody who experiences the practice of yoga honestly and deeply. They will all have a different explanation of what yoga is, what it means to them, what it means to the collective. Everybody has a different idea of what this practice is. And you know what? Here's the thing. All those people are right. As long as they're approaching their yoga with honesty and integrity and with love. Most of them will be right. The sutras, all of these interpretations of the sutras tell us, Patanjali tells us in the sutras why we're doing it. But I haven't talked to you about it, and which I should have. And now, no, it's not by design. It's just kind of how it is, because it's a feeling. In the books, in any interpretation of the sutras, they're all going to explain through their own filter what Patanjali meant by those first few sutras in his explanation of what yoga is. So I'll tell you what I think. When people ask me, Forkes Yogi, what is yoga? I say yoga is the ultimate roadmap to self-discovery and radical self-love. It's right, but that's not what I said. What I would have said when I first started practicing yoga. That is the explanation that has come up in my nearly decade long relationship with this practice as a teacher, as a practitioner, as a devotee to yoga. Satchidananda has a much more practical explanation of what yoga is. He says in his introduction to his commentary and interpretation of translation of the sutras, he says, the physical yoga or hatha yoga was primarily designed to facilitate the real practice of yoga, namely the understanding and complete mastery over the mind. So the actual meaning of yoga is the science of the mind. Science of the mind. Science of the mind. So that is his very concrete description, definition of what yoga is. But it's also an interpretation of the second sutra in book 1, where Satchidananda, Patanjali, where Patanjali tells that yoga, the restraint of the modifications of the mind stuff, is yoga. And then he goes on to explain Patanjali and everybody, because that's what they're doing. Then Patanjali goes on to explain what mind stuff is and all of these modifications of the mind are. That's great. Because then he gets into this very technical talk of what those modifications of the mind are. Nischala Joy Devi describes a more heart-centered interpretation of what yoga is. Yoga is the uniting of consciousness in the heart. We start thinking with our heart instead of the brain, instead of. It is a togetherness of joining of all of your separate consciousness, because yoga, the word yoga, literally means to tie together in Sanskrit, to yoke. What are we yoking, right? What are we tying together? Philosophically, yeah. In the tradition where yoga comes from, the purpose of this restraint of the modifications of the mind stuff is to remove us from the cycle of life, cycle of rebirth, to reach nirvana, because we all come in pure. We come in pure, and then we live and pick up the dirt of the world from living in this world. So yoga, the practice of yoga, is an effort for us to remove those modifications of the mind stuff. And eventually, as we move into this series of us, this explanation, this deeper explanation of these different paths of yoga, we'll get into more in depth into what specifically those mind stuff, the mind stuff of the parts of us, the parts of consciousness that are being united with this practice of yoga. When we first read the sutras, when we first open the book, it is very distinct and it's very it's technical. It's a technical book. So instead of thinking of it as a scripture, as a story, like there's not a lot of mythology in the sutras. It is a step-by-step. It is step-by-step instructions on how to practice yoga, the physical, mental, all of it. Still scripture, still a holy book, but think of it more as a textbook, a reference book, not a tomes, or not tomes, that's not the word, anecdotes, that kind of thing, stories for you to learn from. That's not what it is. It's a list. It's literally a numbered list of 200 and something things of what you got to do and how to do it, right? That's why you need the other books as well. But also, this is why this is the book that we use the most, because there isn't a lot of room for interpretation. It can be misinterpreted, but it's not a moment of contemplation. Anyway, so when you pick up the sutras, you read the first two. According to Patanjali, Satchidananda, I have to stop doing that. According to Satchidananda, That should be enough. That should be enough. To be perfectly honest, it really is enough. All right, cool. So the restraint of the modifications of the mind stuff is yoga. Okay, that's why I'm doing it. Or yoga is the uniting of the consciousness and the heart. Okay, cool. Why are we doing this? That's what it is. That's literally the what of yoga. Yoga is the uniting of consciousness and the heart, the restraint of the modifications of the mind stuff is yoga. Uniting of consciousness and the heart, restraint of the mind stuff. Both things saying kind of the same thing. Different interpretations, but both saying the same thing. But then it goes on, of course, to explain a little bit more. Sutras 3 and 4 complete the why, right? So I'll read them all together. According to Satchidananda's interpretation of Book 2, start again. According to, no, Satchidananda's interpretation of Sutra, I'm sorry. Satchidananda's interpretation of Book 1, Sutras 2 through 4 are the restraint of the modifications of the mind stuff is yoga. Then the seer, self, abides in its own nature. At other times, the self appears to assume the forms of mental modifications. And then he goes on to explain the mental modifications. Nischala Joy Devi, the same sutras, describes those sutras as yoga is the uniting of consciousness in the heart. United in the heart, consciousness is steady. Then we abide in our true nature, joy. At other times, we identify with the rays of consciousness, which fluctuate and encourage our perceived suffering. Now, our perceived suffering. Her interpretation, while heart-centered and less direct, gives us a bigger clue into why we're doing this. Encourage at other times we identify with the rays of consciousness which fluctuate and encourage our perceived suffering. Perceived suffering. Encourage our perceived suffering. So the idea that we identify with the things that make us, with this vessel, with our stuff, with the things that are ever changing, instead of identifying with the seer, the self, the unchanged experiencer of this whole operation. That is what yoga is. It is to divorce ourselves of the tethers of this mortal coil. And in order for us to do that, there are several different paths for us to follow. We already talked about Ashtanga or Raja Yoga, the 8-limb path. And it is called Raja Yoga. Is called because some schools of yoga still call Ashtanga Yoga Raja Yoga, especially if they have a physical Ashtanga Yoga class or practice. We'll get all the way into that too. So the 8 limbs are all the way like at the end, towards the center of book 2. Now we we're all the way, he's already said about 8,000 things for us to do before. Well, the reason that Ashtanga yoga isn't mentioned until like halfway through book 2 is because he already talks about all the 8 limbs before we even get there. So there are specifically in the sutra, Patanjali describes 7 paths, 7 yogic paths, 7 ways to practice, to remain on this path of unification, liberation, togetherness. They are Bhakti Yoga, Kriya Yoga, Karma Yoga, Jnana Yoga, Ashtanga Yoga, Hatha Yoga, and Tara Yoga. Now, here's the thing. All of those yogas are just the 8 limbs mixed and matched together. Because just like in the Bhagavad Gita and Krishna talking to Arjuna about his work and his dharma, here's the thing about yoga. If you do a little bit of it honestly, you end up doing all of it all anyway. If you do a little bit of it honestly, you end up doing it all anyway, right? So in this series of us discussing yoga, the what and why of yoga, well, not the series because it's still moving different, in this series of sessions where we're going to discuss yoga and the different ways that the different paths of yoga, we're going to learn about all of it. And in that description of these different paths of yoga, we'll get also much, much deeper into the philosophy of yoga and what those modifications of the mind are and how we ourselves are in charge of this whole operation, towards liberation, freedom, wisdom, all of that. Well, that's all I got for now. If you liked it, great. If not, that's cool too. Until next time, be well.